The people who respect your title will disappear the moment they think you've lost it, but the people who respect you will stay no matter what. I didn't know it then, but that lesson was waiting for me beneath a 40-foot Christmas tree in the heart of downtown Chicago. My name is Michael Carter. I was 46 years old, and if you had walked into the Whitmore Global Christmas Gala that night, you probably wouldn't have looked at me twice. The ballroom shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers. Golden lights wrapped around towering columns. A jazz band played soft holiday classics near the stage while servers moved through the crowd carrying silver trays filled with sparkling drinks and miniature desserts. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, fresh snow drifted across the city skyline, turning the streets below into a postcard. Inside, nearly 500 employees celebrated another record-breaking year. They were smiling, laughing, congratulating one another, and talking about bonuses, promotions, and future opportunities. My wife Vanessa fit perfectly into that world. She moved through the room with effortless confidence, dressed in an elegant emerald gown that seemed designed specifically for Christmas. People gravitated toward her. They always did. She was intelligent, ambitious, and one of the company's fastest-rising executives. Everywhere she went, conversations paused and attention followed. I stood beside her, smiling politely whenever someone glanced in my direction. Most didn't. That wasn't unusual. Over the years, I had become accustomed to being overlooked. "Vanessa, congratulations on the expansion project," one manager said. "Thank you," she replied with a bright smile. "It's been a lot of work." Then the manager looked at me. "And you must be Michael." "Must be. Not nice to see you again." "Not good evening. Just must be." I shook his hand anyway. "Good to meet you." The conversation lasted less than 10 seconds before his attention returned to Vanessa. That pattern repeated itself all evening. I wasn't offended. In fact, I found it oddly fascinating. People reveal a great deal about themselves when they assume you have nothing to offer them. By 8 o'clock, the ballroom was packed. Christmas music floated through the air while executives clustered near the center of the room. At the far end stood Brandon Pierce, the company's CEO. Brandon had the polished confidence of a man who enjoyed being the center of attention. Expensive watch. Perfect smile. Tailored suit. Every joke he told earned laughter. Every opinion he shared was treated like wisdom. When he noticed Vanessa approaching, his face lit up. "There she is," he announced. "The woman who saved our fourth quarter." Several people laughed and raised their glasses. Vanessa smiled. "You're giving me too much credit." "Not possible," Brandon replied. Then his eyes shifted toward me. "And Michael, good to see you." I nodded. "Good seeing you too." Brandon placed a hand on my shoulder. "Still enjoying the easy life?" A few people chuckled. Vanessa laughed with them. It wasn't a cruel laugh. Not yet. Just comfortable. Casual. The kind of laugh that comes when someone forgets they're speaking about a person instead of an idea. "Michael's an expert at avoiding stress," she said. "I think he's got life figured out." More laughter followed. I smiled politely. The truth was, I had learned long ago that silence often tells you more than words ever could. So I listened. I listened as conversations drifted toward success, money, status, and influence. I listened as people measured human value through job titles and office size. And I listened as Vanessa slowly became more relaxed with every compliment she received. The later it got, the more confident she became. The more confident she became, the less careful she was. Around 9:30, guests gathered closer to the stage for the evening presentation. The enormous Christmas tree glowed at the center of the ballroom, reflecting thousands of tiny lights across polished marble floors. Cameras flashed. Glasses clinked. Holiday music swelled through hidden speakers. Standing there beneath those lights, I looked around the room and noticed something strange. Several members of the company's board of directors had just arrived. Most guests barely noticed them. I did. One of them briefly glanced across the ballroom. Our eyes met for less than a second. His expression changed immediately. Not surprise. Recognition. Then he looked away and continued walking. Nobody else seemed to notice. Vanessa certainly didn't. She was too busy enjoying the attention surrounding her. I remember taking a slow breath and looking up at the Christmas lights hanging above us. Everything appeared perfect. The music, the decorations, the smiles, the celebration. From the outside, it looked like the happiest night of the year. But sometimes the moment that changes your life arrives disguised as an ordinary evening. Sometimes it hides behind laughter. Sometimes it hides behind applause. And sometimes it waits beneath a Christmas tree while an entire room prepares to discover a truth they never saw coming. The awards ceremony ended, but the energy inside the ballroom only grew stronger. Conversations overlapped beneath the music, and every corner of the room seemed filled with people celebrating their success. Vanessa remained at the center of it all. Employees stopped her every few steps to congratulate her. Managers shook her hand. Executives praised her leadership. Each compliment seemed to build upon the last, creating an invisible wall between her and everyone she considered less important. I stayed nearby, content to observe. Years of experience had taught me that people often reveal their true character during moments of victory. Defeat makes people cautious. Success makes them comfortable. And comfortable people tend to say exactly what they think. Around 10:30, Brandon gathered several senior managers near one of the cocktail tables overlooking the city. The snow outside had become heavier now, drifting past the glass in thick, white waves. Chicago looked almost peaceful from 40 stories above the street. Inside, however, the atmosphere felt increasingly different. Someone joked about retirement. Another person joked about people who lived off successful spouses. The comments were framed as humor, but each one seemed directed toward me. Brandon looked in my direction and smiled. "Michael has it all figured out," he announced. "No meetings. No deadlines. No shareholders asking questions." Several people laughed. Vanessa laughed too. "Believe me," she said, lifting her glass slightly. "He has never had much interest in the corporate world." More laughter followed. One executive asked whether I ever felt intimidated by Vanessa's success. Another wondered aloud what it was like being married to one of the company's top performers. I answered politely, keeping my voice calm. "I am proud of her accomplishments." The answer seemed to disappoint them. They were hoping for insecurity, hoping for discomfort, hoping for something they could laugh about. Instead, I simply smiled and took a sip of water. The conversation moved on, but the tone remained the same. It was subtle, not openly hostile, just dismissive. The kind of attitude that develops when people convince themselves they understand someone without ever asking a real question. I noticed Vanessa becoming increasingly comfortable with it. Every joke earned another smile. Every laugh encouraged another comment. It was as though she enjoyed hearing other people define me. More importantly, she no longer felt the need to correct them. That realization bothered me more than anything else. Not because strangers underestimated me. Strangers do that every day. What bothered me was how easily my own wife allowed it to happen. Across the ballroom, I once again noticed several members of the board standing together. They were not drinking. They were not socializing. They were simply observing. One of them looked toward me briefly before speaking quietly to another director. Their expressions remained neutral, but something about their attention felt deliberate, almost cautious, as if they were waiting to see how the evening unfolded. Meanwhile, Brandon's group continued growing larger. More managers joined. More employees gathered nearby. Vanessa stood beside him, enjoying the spotlight. "You know what I admire most about Vanessa?" Brandon said loudly. "She earned everything herself." Applause followed. Vanessa smiled. "Thank you." Brandon continued. "That kind of drive is rare." Then his eyes shifted toward me again. "Not everyone is willing to work that hard." The group laughed. A few people glanced at me, waiting, watching, measuring my reaction. I gave them none. The truth was, I felt surprisingly calm. Not because their comments did not matter, but because moments like these create clarity. You begin seeing relationships exactly as they are rather than how you wish they were. Standing there beneath the glow of Christmas lights, I realized something important. The room was full of successful people, but very few were paying attention. They saw job titles. They saw appearances. They saw status. Almost nobody seemed interested in character. The music changed again. A slower holiday song drifted through the speakers. More guests moved toward the dance floor. Laughter echoed beneath the chandeliers. Yet despite the celebration, I could feel tension quietly building beneath the surface. Vanessa seemed different now than she had earlier in the evening. More confident, more animated, more willing to speak without thinking. It was the kind of confidence that often appears right before someone makes a mistake. Looking back, I think that was the moment everything truly began. Not because of what had already happened, but because of what was coming next. The night still looked beautiful. The city still glowed beyond the windows. The giant Christmas tree still sparkled at the center of the ballroom. But sometimes the most important turning points in life arrive while everything appears perfectly normal. And as I stood there watching the snow fall beyond the glass, I had the unmistakable feeling that this evening was heading somewhere none of us could stop. A few minutes later, the ballroom lights dimmed slightly as the band prepared for another set. The giant Christmas tree remained the centerpiece of the room, glowing beneath thousands of tiny white lights. Guests drifted between tables, collecting desserts and fresh drinks while conversations continued around every corner. The atmosphere should have felt festive. Instead, I found myself paying attention to details. The expressions people wore when they thought nobody was looking. The way certain executives laughed harder whenever Brandon was nearby. The way others immediately changed their opinions too. Matches. Success creates followers. Real character creates leaders. The difference is not always obvious until the pressure arrives. I stood near one of the decorated archways when Vanessa approached carrying 2 glasses. She handed one toward me. "You have been awfully quiet tonight," she said. "I usually am." She smiled, but there was something different behind it now. A confidence that bordered on arrogance. "You know," she said, glancing toward the executives gathered near the stage. "Some people spend years trying to earn a seat at those tables." I followed her gaze. "And some people spend years learning that the table does not matter." She laughed softly. "That sounds like something people say when they never had the opportunity." The comment hung between us for a moment. Years earlier, she never would have said something like that. At least not to me. I looked at her carefully. Success had changed many things in our lives. Our home, our social circle, our routines. Perhaps it had changed something else too. Before I could answer, Brandon appeared again. "There you two are." He slipped naturally into the conversation. "We were just talking about next year." Vanessa brightened immediately. "Good things, I hope." "Very good things." Brandon smiled. "The board is paying attention." I noticed the way her posture changed. The way her eyes lit up. Recognition mattered deeply to her now. Brandon continued discussing future opportunities. Promotions. Leadership roles. Expanded responsibilities. Several nearby managers gathered around to listen. Every sentence seemed designed to elevate Vanessa further in their eyes. Then Brandon glanced toward me. "Michael, I have a serious question." "All right. What is your secret?" I raised an eyebrow. "My secret? You seem completely relaxed all the time. No deadlines. No corporate politics. No pressure." He laughed. "Honestly, I think half this room envies you." Several people nearby smiled. Others listened carefully. Brandon leaned slightly closer. "If you had the chance to trade places with Vanessa, would you?" The crowd seemed genuinely interested in the answer. I considered the question for a second. "No." The response surprised them. "No," Brandon repeated. "Not even for a day?" I shook my head. People spend too much time chasing positions and not enough time understanding themselves. The group fell quiet for a brief moment. Then one manager laughed awkwardly. Another shrugged. Brandon smiled, but something about his expression had changed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. The look people get when they are not sure whether they are speaking to someone ordinary or someone they may have underestimated. Before anyone could respond, applause erupted near the entrance. Several members of the board had officially joined the celebration. Guests turned toward them immediately. Conversations shifted. Attention followed. I noticed something interesting. The same executives who had spent the evening joking moments earlier now seemed eager to impress the directors. Their posture changed. Their tone changed. Their confidence became performance. Vanessa watched them with obvious interest. Ambition practically radiated from her. Meanwhile, one of the directors glanced across the ballroom. His eyes found mine almost instantly. The recognition was immediate. He gave the slightest nod before continuing toward another group. Brandon noticed it, only for a second, but I saw his expression. Confusion, curiosity. The moment passed quickly, yet it planted a seed. For the first time all evening, he seemed uncertain about something. The music resumed. Guests returned to their conversations. The celebration continued. But beneath the holiday atmosphere, I could feel a different current moving through the room. Questions were beginning to form. Small observations. Tiny inconsistencies. Nothing dramatic yet. Just enough to create doubt. And once doubt enters a room, certainty rarely survives for long. By 11:15, the crowd had settled into that strange stage every corporate party eventually reaches. where formal professionalism begins blending with personal opinions. The speeches were over. The awards had been handed out. The photographs had been taken. What remained were conversations, assumptions, and the quiet competition that always exists beneath polished smiles. I found myself standing near the balcony doors, watching snow sweep across the Chicago skyline. The city lights shimmered through the falling white flakes, turning the glass into a living painting. Behind me, laughter rolled through the ballroom again. I did not need to turn around to know where it was coming from. Brandon had gathered another audience. Vanessa was still beside him. They looked comfortable together, not in a romantic sense, but in the way ambitious people often do when they share the same worldview. They understood each other. Titles mattered. Recognition mattered. Status mattered. I used to think those things were tools. Somewhere along the way, they had become goals. "There you are," Vanessa said as she approached once more. "I was starting to think you left." "Not yet." She glanced around before lowering her voice slightly. "You could try a little harder to socialize." I smiled faintly. "I have been socializing." "That is not what I mean." Her eyes moved toward the executives near the center of the room. "These people matter." The sentence stayed with me for a moment. These people matter. Not these relationships. Not these conversations. These people. As though value could be measured by position alone. "Everybody matters," I said calmly. She laughed softly. "That sounds nice, but it is not how the real world works." Before I could answer, another executive joined us. Then another. Within seconds, the conversation shifted toward promotions again. Someone mentioned that Vanessa was becoming one of the most influential leaders in the company. Another joked that she would probably outrank half the people in the room within a few years. Brandon overheard and raised his glass. "A few years," he said. "You are being conservative." The group laughed. Vanessa smiled. "You are all making me sound more important than I am." "No," Brandon replied. "We are finally giving you the credit you deserve." The compliment landed exactly where he intended. I watched Vanessa's expression change. Pride, satisfaction, validation. It reminded me of something my father once told me. He said praise is like sugar. A little makes life sweeter. Too much changes your judgment. The conversation continued. Future opportunities, leadership pathways, strategic influence. Then someone asked a simple question. "Vanessa, what is the biggest challenge you have faced while climbing the ladder?" She thought about it for a second. "Honestly," several people nodded. "Honestly, sometimes the hardest thing is carrying people who do not share your ambition." The group laughed politely. I noticed Brandon glance toward me. So did several others. The implication was obvious. Vanessa noticed it too. Instead of correcting them, she continued smiling. That hurt more than I expected. Not because strangers misunderstood me, because she allowed them to. Years ago, she would have defended me without hesitation. Now she seemed content to let the room reach whatever conclusion benefited her image. Across the ballroom, Robert Langley appeared again. This time he was accompanied by 2 additional directors. The 3 men paused briefly near one of the holiday displays. One of them looked toward me, then another. They exchanged a few quiet words before continuing their conversation. Brandon noticed it again. I could tell. His smile remained in place, but curiosity had begun replacing confidence. He was trying to solve a puzzle. The problem was that he did not yet realize he was missing most of the pieces. Meanwhile, the party continued. Christmas music drifted through hidden speakers. Waiters carried trays of desserts. Snow fell steadily outside. Everything looked beautiful. Yet beneath the decorations and celebration, the room felt increasingly fragile. People often believe important moments announce themselves. They expect alarms, warnings, dramatic entrances. Real life rarely works that way. Most turning points begin quietly. A comment that goes too far. An assumption repeated too many times. A truth ignored for too long. Standing there beneath thousands of Christmas lights, surrounded by laughter and applause, I realized something had already changed. Not in the company, not in the city outside the windows. In me. For the first time all evening, I stopped hoping Vanessa would notice what was happening. And the moment I stopped hoping, I began seeing everything. Clearly, the elevator doors closed quietly behind me, shutting out the music, the laughter, and the conversations that had filled the evening. For a few seconds, I stood alone as the elevator descended through the tower. The numbers above the door changed 1 floor at a time. 48, 47, 46. I stared at my reflection in the polished steel wall, and felt something I had not experienced in months. Peace. Not happiness. Not satisfaction. Just peace. The kind that comes when a decision has finally been made. My phone was still pressed against my ear. The call connected before I reached the lobby. Michael, Robert Langley answered. His voice sounded calm, as though he had been expecting the call. I assume you have left the party. I have. There was a brief pause, and I stepped out into the marble lobby. Outside, snow swirled beneath the streetlights. It is time. Robert did not sound surprised. I thought you might say that. Through the glass doors I could see traffic moving slowly through the winter weather. Chicago looked different after midnight. Cleaner, quieter, more honest somehow. Can everyone be there? I asked. By morning. Robert replied. Yes. Full attendance. Another pause. You understand what that means. I looked back toward the elevators that led to the ballroom above. I do. Very well, Robert said. 9 o'clock. The call ended. Just like that. No speeches. No dramatic declarations. No threats. Important decisions rarely require many words. I slipped the phone into my coat pocket and stepped outside into the cold. Snow landed on my shoulders almost immediately. The wind carried the distant sound of traffic through the city streets. Across the avenue, Christmas lights decorated storefront windows and lamp posts. Most people would have called it a beautiful night. They would have been right. I stood there for a moment, looking up at the tower where the party continued several floors above me. Somewhere inside, Brandon was probably discussing next year's plans. Vanessa was probably still surrounded by executives congratulating her on her success. Neither of them knew what had happened in the last 60 seconds. Neither of them knew what would happen in less than 10 hours. A black sedan pulled up to the curb. The driver stepped out and opened the rear door. Good evening, sir. I nodded and got inside. The warmth of the cabin replaced the winter air immediately. As the car pulled away from the building, I watched the tower disappear behind falling snow. My thoughts drifted backward. Not years, just months. There had been signs. Small moments that seemed insignificant at the time. Vanessa becoming increasingly interested in titles. Increasingly concerned with appearances. Increasingly dismissive whenever I questioned the direction things were heading. At first I blamed stress, then ambition. Eventually, I realized neither explanation was entirely accurate. Success had simply removed the filters. It had revealed priorities that were always there. The driver turned onto Lakeshore Drive. The city lights reflected against the dark waters of Lake Michigan. My phone vibrated again. A new message appeared from Robert. Attendance confirmed. Every board member. I read the message once and locked the screen. Then another notification appeared. This time it was from an executive assistant employed by the corporate office. Emergency board meeting scheduled. 9 a.m. attendance required. The distribution list was extensive. Directors, executive leadership, legal counsel, internal audit. The machine was already moving. Once certain processes begin, they rarely stop. I leaned back and closed my eyes. Oddly enough, I felt no desire for revenge. That surprised me. Most people assume power is about punishment. In reality, power is often about clarity, seeing a situation exactly as it is and acting accordingly. Nothing more, nothing less. 20 minutes later, I arrived home. The house was quiet. Christmas decorations glowed softly through the front windows. A wreath hung on the door. White lights lined the walkway. From the outside, it looked like the home of a happy couple preparing for the holidays. Appearances can be remarkably convincing. Inside, I removed my coat, loosened my tie, and walked into my study. The room was dark except for the small desk lamp near the bookshelf. I sat down and opened a secure folder on my laptop. Documents appeared instantly. Reports, agreements, historical records, information most people never knew existed. I reviewed them carefully, not because I needed to, but because habits matter. Preparation matters. Details matter. Nearly an hour passed before I finally closed the laptop. Outside, snow continued falling across the city. Inside, the clock on the wall ticked steadily toward morning. Somewhere after 1 o'clock, I heard the front door open. Vanessa had finally come home. Vanessa spent the entire drive downtown checking her phone. Every few minutes another message arrived. Another calendar update. Another notification marked urgent. The confidence she had carried home from the Christmas party was fading with each passing mile. Snow lined the streets of Chicago as traffic moved cautiously through the morning. Holiday decorations still hung from light poles, but nobody inside the car seemed interested in them. Vanessa was too focused on her screen. "This makes no sense," she said quietly. "Emergency board meetings do not happen without warning." I kept my attention on the road ahead. Maybe something important came up. She shook her head. Something major would have leaked already. The certainty in her voice reminded me of Brandon. They shared the same belief that information always flowed downward through predictable channels. The reality was different. Some decisions moved so high above the normal structure that most executives never saw them coming. We reached the corporate tower shortly before 8:45. Employees were arriving in unusually large numbers for a day that was supposed to be relatively quiet after the holiday celebration. Groups stood near elevators speaking in hushed voices. Phones were pressed against ears. Security personnel seemed more visible than usual. Nobody looked relaxed. Vanessa noticed it immediately. Something is definitely wrong. We stepped into the lobby together. The massive Christmas display still occupied the center of the marble floor. The same decorations that had looked festive the night before now felt strangely out of place. Anxiety changes the way people see everything. Near the elevators, several senior managers were already gathered. Brandon stood among them. The moment he spotted Vanessa, he walked over. "Have you heard anything?" he asked. "Nothing. Neither have I." His expression looked strained for the first time since I had met him. "Legal is here. Internal audit is here. Half the board is already upstairs." Vanessa frowned. "What about Robert?" "He arrived before 7. Brandon glanced toward the elevator bank. "Nobody is saying a word." For a brief moment his eyes landed on me. There was curiosity there. Suspicion too. Then the elevator doors opened and the conversation ended. We rode upward with nearly a dozen executives. Nobody talked. The silence inside the elevator felt heavier than any conversation could have. When the doors finally opened on the executive floor, people immediately began moving toward conference rooms and offices. Assistants hurried through hallways carrying folders and tablets. The atmosphere reminded me of a storm approaching. You could not see it yet, but everyone could feel the pressure changing. Vanessa turned toward me. "You do not need to stay for this." "Probably not." She nodded absently, already distracted by the situation around her. Then she followed Brandon down the hallway. I watched them disappear before taking a different route. Unlike them, I was not heading toward the executive conference room. I was heading toward the private board suite at the end of the corridor. A security officer standing outside the entrance opened the door the moment he saw me. "Good morning, sir." "Good morning." Inside, the atmosphere was entirely different. Calm, organized, deliberate. Robert Langley stood near the window overlooking the city. 3 other directors were reviewing documents at the conference table. The moment I entered, every conversation stopped. Robert smiled slightly. "Right on time." Traffic cooperated. Several directors laughed quietly. The tension that dominated the rest of the building did not exist here. These people already knew why they were present. They already understood what was coming. Robert gestured toward the head of the table. "Everything is ready." I looked at the folders arranged neatly before each chair. Legal findings, governance reviews, internal reports, historical ownership records. Years of information condensed into a single morning. "Has everyone arrived?" I asked. Robert nodded. "Every director, every required department, every executive requested." He paused briefly, "Including Brandon Pierce." I nodded. "And Vanessa?" "She is outside with the others." For a moment, nobody spoke. Snow drifted past the windows high above the city. The skyline looked almost white beneath the winter clouds. Robert finally broke the silence. "After today, things will be different." I looked toward the conference room doors. Beyond them, executives were still trying to understand what was happening, still trying to guess, still trying to control a situation that had already moved beyond their reach. "They already are," I said. Then I took my seat at the head of the table. For several long seconds, nobody in the conference room moved. The only sound came from the heating system humming softly somewhere behind the walls. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, snow continued drifting across the Chicago skyline. But inside the room, time itself seemed to have stopped. Brandon was the first person to recover. He looked toward Robert Langley, then toward the other directors, as if waiting for someone to laugh and explain that this was some kind of misunderstanding. Nobody did. Every director remained calm. Every folder remained open. Every document remained exactly where it had been placed. The silence became its own answer. Vanessa finally looked away from me and down at the folder sitting in front of her. Her hands moved slowly as she opened it. I watched her eyes scan the first page, then the second, then the third. The color gradually drained from her face. There it was. The ownership structure, the founding records, the controlling shares, the governance agreements. Facts do not care about assumptions. Facts simply exist. Around the table, other executives were reading the same documents. Several looked shocked. Others looked embarrassed. A few appeared frightened. I understood why. Less than 12 hours. Earlier, many of those same people had participated in conversations built entirely on assumptions about who I was and what role I played in the world around them. Now they were being forced to confront reality. Robert allowed the room a few moments to absorb the information before speaking again. The purpose of today's meeting extends beyond ownership clarification, he said. Additional findings require review. Legal counsel distributed another set of documents. This time the atmosphere shifted from surprise to concern. Brandon immediately began reading. His confident posture disappeared almost instantly. Internal audit representatives remained expressionless while executives turned pages. I noticed Brandon reading faster with each passing second. He was searching for something. Looking for context. Looking for an explanation. Looking for an exit. Over the last 12 months, Robert continued, multiple governance concerns have been identified regarding executive oversight, reporting procedures, and authorization practices. Nobody interrupted. Nobody challenged him. The evidence was already sitting in front of them. Numbers, reports, approvals, signatures, timelines. Everything had been reviewed carefully. Everything had been verified. Vanessa looked increasingly confused. She turned several pages, then glanced toward Brandon. He avoided eye contact. That was the moment I realized she understood less about the situation than anyone else in the room. She had spent years climbing a ladder without fully understanding who built it. Brandon finally cleared his throat. With respect, he said carefully, "Why are these matters being presented now?" Robert looked toward me before answering. Because the controlling shareholder requested a complete review. The words landed heavily. Not because they were dramatic. Because they were simple, direct, final. Several executives looked toward me again. Not with curiosity this time. With recognition. Real recognition. The kind that appears when assumptions collapse. Brandon remained silent. He knew arguing would accomplish nothing. Facts had a way of eliminating debate. Vanessa's eyes slowly moved toward me. There was confusion there. Disbelief. Regret. Perhaps all three. Yet what struck me most was how little she actually knew about the man she had been married to. Years together. Countless conversations. Shared holidays. Shared homes. Shared plans. And still she had never asked the questions that mattered. Not because the answers were hidden. Because she assumed she already knew them. Robert continued guiding the meeting through formal agenda items. Governance reviews. Executive accountability. Strategic oversight. Legal recommendations. The discussion lasted nearly an hour. During that time, nobody raised their voice. Nobody created a scene. Real power rarely requires volume. It simply requires truth supported by evidence. By the end of the presentation, the atmosphere in the room felt entirely different from when the meeting began. Confidence had become caution. Assumptions had become facts. Certainty had become reflection. Brandon sat quietly staring at the documents before him. Vanessa remained motionless. Every promotion she had imagined. Every conversation from the previous evening. Every assumption she had made about success, status, and importance now existed in a completely different context. Finally, Robert closed his folder. That concludes the review. The room remained silent. Then he looked toward me. "Michael, would you like to add anything?" 20 pairs of eyes turned in my direction. I looked around the table slowly. At the executives. At the directors. At Brandon. At Vanessa. Then I spoke for the first time since the meeting began. "Only this," I said calmly. "The value of a person is never determined by how much attention they receive in a room. It is determined by who they are when nobody believes they matter." Nobody responded. Nobody needed to. Because judging by the expressions around that table, the lesson had already been learned. The elevator carried me down through the tower in complete silence. Floor after floor slipped past while I stared at the changing numbers above the door. For years I had intentionally stayed out of the spotlight. For years, I had allowed other people to underestimate me because it revealed far more about them than it ever did about me. Yet as the elevator descended, I found myself thinking less about the company and more about Vanessa. The revelation in the conference room had changed everything professionally, but the real damage had happened long before that meeting ever began. It happened one small decision at a time, one assumption at a time, one moment of disrespect at a time. When the doors opened into the private executive lobby, several employees immediately stepped aside. Their reactions were subtle, but impossible to miss. Yesterday, I had been invisible. Today, I was suddenly important. That contrast told me everything I needed to know about how most people measured value. I walked through the lobby and entered a smaller conference room where Robert and two directors were waiting. Fresh reports covered the table. Financial summaries, governance recommendations, transition plans. Robert gestured toward an empty chair. The announcements are already having an effect. I glanced at the documents. Several executive access levels had been temporarily suspended pending review. Internal audits were expanding. Multiple departments were preparing compliance reports. The machine was moving exactly as expected. And Brandon? I asked. Robert exchanged a brief look with another director. His morning has become considerably more complicated. I nodded. Complexity tends to arrive quickly when accountability finally appears. Robert slid another folder toward me. There is something else you should see. Inside were transcripts of executive communications, internal recommendations, and leadership evaluations from the previous 18 months. I scanned several pages. The information confirmed what I had suspected for a long time. Certain people had become increasingly comfortable making decisions without oversight. Success had convinced them they were untouchable. History rarely rewards that belief. An hour later, I left the conference room and walked through the executive floor once again. The atmosphere had changed dramatically. Employees spoke quietly. Managers moved with unusual urgency. Even the holiday decorations seemed out of place now. Near the corner offices, I noticed Brandon standing alone beside a window overlooking the city. He saw me immediately. For a moment, he appeared uncertain whether to approach. Then he made a decision and walked toward me. Michael. Brandon. He stopped several feet away. The confidence from the Christmas party was completely gone. I did not know. I studied him calmly. No, you did not. He looked toward the snow-covered skyline. A lot of things make more sense now. Do they? He gave a short laugh. Not a happy one. Honestly, not really. The answer surprised me. At least it was honest. Brandon looked back toward me. If I crossed a line, I would like the opportunity to correct it. I thought about the conversations from the previous evening. The jokes. The assumptions. The way he measured people through titles and visibility. Correction starts with understanding, I said. Not apology. He nodded slowly. Perhaps for the first time, he was actually listening. We stood there for a moment before he excused himself and walked away. As I continued down the hallway, I spotted Vanessa near the executive offices. She was speaking with nobody, simply standing beside a window holding the same folder she had carried since the meeting ended. When she saw me approaching, she did not move. Neither did I. Eventually, I stopped a few feet away. Snow drifted beyond the glass behind her. The city looked calm despite the storm moving through the company. I keep replaying last night in my head, she said quietly. I said nothing. The conversations, the jokes, everything. Her voice carried none of its usual confidence. I did not realize how it sounded. I looked at her for several seconds before responding. That is the problem, Vanessa. She lowered her eyes. I know. For the first time all day, there was no argument. No justification. No explanation. Just honesty. It was a start. Whether it was enough remained to be seen. Somewhere down the hallway, employees continued moving between offices while directors reviewed reports and lawyers prepared recommendations. The company was changing. The people inside it were changing too. Standing there beside the window, watching snow fall across Chicago, I realized. The biggest revelation of the day was not that people had finally learned who I was. It was that they were finally beginning to see who they had become. 3 weeks passed before I returned to the executive floor. By then, the Christmas decorations had been taken down, the holiday lights had disappeared from the lobby, and the city had settled into the quiet rhythm of winter. Chicago looked different without the seasonal glow, but the company looked different too. The atmosphere felt calmer, more focused, less driven by appearances. The governance changes approved by the board were already producing results. Teams communicated more openly. Reporting structures were clearer. Decisions were being examined rather than simply accepted. Stability was returning. As I walked through the building that morning, employees greeted me politely. Some knew exactly who I was now. Others only knew pieces of the story. Neither reaction mattered much to me anymore. What mattered was whether people learned something from what had happened. A title can open a door, but character determines what happens after you walk through it. Later that afternoon, I met with Robert Langley in the same conference room where everything had changed. Snow drifted past the windows while we reviewed quarterly projections and transition updates. When the meeting ended, Robert closed his folder and smiled. The company is healthier than it was a month ago. Good. You were right about one thing. I looked up. Only one. He laughed. People were measuring the wrong things. I glanced toward the city beyond the glass. Most people do. After he left, I remained alone for a few minutes. The room felt strangely familiar. I could still remember the silence that followed the ownership announcement. The disbelief. The realization. The moment assumptions collapsed beneath the weight of facts. Yet the more time passed, the less important that moment seemed. The reveal was never the point. The lesson was. Several days later, Vanessa asked if we could meet for coffee. We chose a small cafe overlooking the river. The winter air was cold enough to fog the windows, and most of the customers sat quietly working on laptops or reading books. When she arrived, she looked different. Not physically, simpler somehow. Less concerned with appearances, more present. We spoke for nearly an hour. Not about ownership, not about board meetings, not about promotions. We talked about choices, about priorities, about the subtle ways people lose themselves while chasing approval. There were no dramatic speeches, no perfect resolutions. Real life rarely offers either. At one point, she looked out the window and said something I had not expected. I spent so much time trying to become important that I forgot to be grateful. The honesty in her voice surprised me. I nodded. A lot of people make that mistake. She smiled sadly. I know. When we finally stood to leave, neither of us pretended the past could be erased. Some things cannot be undone. Trust, once damaged, requires time. Respect requires consistency. Growth requires honesty. Yet for the first time in a long while, the conversation felt real. A few weeks later, I found myself walking along the river after work. The city lights reflected across the water while a cold breeze moved between the buildings. People hurried home carrying briefcases, shopping bags, and cups of coffee. Everyone seemed to be chasing something. Success, security, recognition, happiness. Maybe all four. I stopped near a bridge and watched the current move beneath me. My thoughts drifted back to the Christmas party, to the laughter, the assumptions, the conversations that once seemed so important. It all felt distant now. The remarkable thing about clarity is that once you find it, many things lose their power over you. Looking back, I realized I had gained something far more valuable than vindication. I gained certainty about who I was. Not because a board recognized it. Not because a company acknowledged it. Because I finally stopped allowing other people to define it. The city lights shimmered across the water as snow began falling once again. Small flakes drifted through the evening air, settling quietly along the river walk. I smiled, pulled my coat a little tighter, and continued walking. Some people spend their lives trying to prove their worth to the world. I learned a different lesson. The moment you truly know your own value, you no longer need anyone else's permission to believe it.